Evan White had always prided himself on his quiet existence. By day, he was a scientist, working in a high-tech lab nestled in the heart of the city. His work revolved around a single passion: energy. More specifically, the kind of energy that could change the world. Antimatter, with its near-infinite potential, was his obsession. Yet, in a world that was focused on practical, safe solutions, his research was considered an eccentricity. That suited Evan just fine, that he wasn't interested in fame, fortune, or the applause of others. In fact, he rarely left the confines of his lab. But his quiet existence wasn't entirely by choice. He often found it difficult to relate to people, unable to connect with them in any meaningful way. His colleagues, like Claire, saw it as a flaw. Claire had once joked during lunch, "You know, Evan, you spend more time with your machines than you do with people. You're like a robot with a pulse." Evan had laughed it off. Claire was nice enough, and she wasn't wrong. He preferred the company of his research to the complexities of human interaction. But what Claire didn't know was that Evan had a secret. One that took him far beyond the realm of physics and into something far more dangerous. Every night, when the lab lights dimmed and the city's noise turned to a distant hum, Evan transformed. As if by clockwork, he donned the dark, sleek suit that had been specially designed to harness the powers of the antimatter generators he had secretly developed. By day, he was the quiet scientist, the unassuming researcher. By night, he was the antimatter guardian, a vigilante who used his knowledge of antimatter to protect the city. Tonight, as usual, Evan worked late, the glow of his computer screen casting a faint blue light over his cluttered desk. He was bent over a set of equations that were growing increasingly complex. Despite his brilliance, there were still unknowns that evaded him, especially when it came to stabilizing the antimatter core he had developed. The project was his magnum opus, a small, efficient generator capable of harnessing antimatter without causing a catastrophic explosion. It could power entire cities, render fossil fuels obsolete, and reshape the global energy market. But it was also incredibly volatile, and any miscalculation could have disastrous consequences. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint buzzing sound from his phone. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. A quick glance at the clock confirmed it was past midnight. He hesitated for a moment before answering, half expecting it to be one of the security personnel calling in a late-night update. "Hello?" he said, his voice calm, controlled. "Are you ready?" The voice on the other end was distorted, almost mechanical. It sent a chill down Evan's spine. "Who is this?" Evan asked, his mind racing. There was something about the voice that unsettled him. "The city is in peril," the voice continued, the words clipped. "We need you. Now." The line went dead before Evan could respond. He stared at the phone in confusion. What was that about? A prank? It was far too strange to be one of the usual late-night calls. And yet, there was something in the tone that didn't feel like a joke. Shaking his head, Evan placed the phone back on the desk and returned to his equations. He tried to push the unsettling message out of his mind. But then his attention was drawn to the small, inconspicuous device on the other side of the room, the antimatter generator. For years, Evan had kept it hidden. It was a masterpiece of science, designed to harness the energy of antimatter in a stable form. But he had never dared to test it on a larger scale. The calculations were too risky. If he were to activate it fully, it could cause an explosion that would obliterate his entire lab, or worse, the city itself. But that night, something shifted. The earlier message, whoever had called, stirred something in him. He was close. So close to discovering a breakthrough that could change everything. And yet, something gnawed at him, an instinctual feeling that couldn't be ignored. He glanced at the generator, considering. With a deep breath, Evan stood up, his movements deliberate. He walked across the lab, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space, and reached for the generator. His fingers brushed against the cool, metallic surface, and a strange hum vibrated through the air. It was alive, ready to activate. He had only ever used it in small, controlled bursts. But tonight, he felt the overwhelming urge to see just how much power it could harness. Without hesitation, he flipped the switch. The air crackled as the generator hummed louder. Evan's heart raced. The device was drawing power, more than he had anticipated. Far more. The glow from the generator intensified, casting an eerie, otherworldly light across the lab. Suddenly, the room began to shake. The walls groaned as if they were being strained beyond their limits. Evan's pulse quickened. This wasn't supposed to happen. The surge was too powerful, and then, with a deafening crack, the lights flickered, the city falls into darkness. Evan's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with the controls. The power levels on the generator were spiking, far beyond what he had planned. If it reached a critical point, it could destabilize the entire power grid of the city, creating an uncontrollable chain reaction. He frantically tried to stabilize the generator, but it was no use. The antimatter energy it had begun to release was feeding into the city's infrastructure, sending ripples of energy through the electrical grid. As the power surged, the city's lights began to flicker, then went out entirely. The hum of machines and the buzz of everyday life fell silent. The city was plunged into darkness. Evan cursed under his breath. This was worse than he'd feared. His experiment had gone horribly wrong. He knew that this kind of power was dangerous, but he had never expected it to escalate so quickly. His mind raced, and for a moment, panic gripped him. He had to fix this. He couldn't let the city suffer because of his recklessness. He reached for his suit, his antimatter guardian suit, a sleek black ensemble that allowed him to channel the energy of the antimatter safely. The suit was his safeguard, protecting him from the dangers of his own abilities. In a blur of motion, Evan changed into the suit, the fabric hugging his body as he activated its internal systems. It hummed with energy, a pulse that resonated with his own heartbeat. As the antimatter guardian, he was the city's protector. But tonight, it was his own power that threatened to destroy everything. He stood at the window, looking out over the darkened skyline. The streets were empty, the usual hum of traffic replaced by an eerie silence. He could sense the instability in the city's power grid, the ripple of energy spreading outward, destabilizing everything in its path. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. If he didn't act quickly, the city would be lost. The lights had gone out, but the real danger lay in the antimatter energy spreading throughout the system. It could cause an explosion, a chain reaction that would level entire blocks of the city. Evan knew what he had to do. He moved swiftly, using his suit's advanced systems to track the energy readings in the city. His mind was racing, his thoughts disjointed as he calculated the best course of action. Every second counted. Evan's pulse raced as he moved through the darkened streets, his suit's systems humming softly in the silence. The lights of the city were out, the familiar noise of traffic and people had vanished, and all that remained was a low, almost unnatural quiet. He could feel the instability in the air, the energy threatening to break free from the confines of the grid. The city was on the edge of collapse, and every passing second brought them closer to disaster. His eyes scanned the city below, looking for any sign of the surge. The generator's energy was still unstable, pulsing like a beating heart. Evan's breath came in shallow gasps. The more energy he drew from the generator, the closer he came to pushing himself to the brink. He could feel the burn deep inside his body, his strength slipping as his own reserves of energy dwindled with every step he took. The suit, while it allowed him to contain the antimatter, was not without its limitations. He had to be careful. Too much power, too quickly, and it could rip him apart. He wasn't the only one aware of the instability, though. The Shard was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, with the city's power grid in shambles, the time had come. As Evan neared the city's main power facility, a crackling noise filled the air, followed by a voice, low and distorted. It echoed in his suit's comm system, a signal so sharp that it nearly made him stumble. "Do you feel it?" The voice was cold, detached, almost amused. "The energy is mine now." Your little experiment, your precious power, it's only the beginning. Evan froze. The shard. He had heard rumors of this figure, a shadow, a phantom who had been studying energy manipulation for years. But until now, Evan had never faced him directly. Now, the shard's voice was everywhere, seeping into the very fabric of the city's power grid, manipulating the energy for his own purpose. Stop it. Evan growled, his voice muffled by the mask of his suit. He could feel the energy warping, twisting, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. The shard didn't respond right away. Instead, there was only the faint sound of laughter, as if the villain were enjoying the chaos. Evan moved quickly, his feet barely touching the ground as he sprinted through the alleys and streets toward the heart of the energy surge. The closer he got to the power station, the more intense the pull of energy became. His limbs began to ache, his suit struggling to maintain its stability as the antimatter inside him raged, barely contained. The shard was feeding off the very thing that made him the antimatter guardian. And Evan knew, deep down, that if he couldn't stop him now, everything they had fought for would collapse. The city was silent, too silent. And then, without warning, the ground beneath Evan's feet shook violently. It felt like a blast of raw energy, a force that rattled the very bones of the city. The lights flickered, and then a brilliant flash of blue light erupted in the sky, illuminating the streets for miles. Evan slammed into a nearby building to steady himself, his heart racing. He couldn't let this continue. If the shard was unleashing this kind of energy, it meant only one thing: he was preparing to finish what Evan had started. With a sudden burst of strength, Evan launched himself into the air, using the suit's propulsion system to soar over the rooftops. The energy surge was coming from the central power station. The shard was there. Evan could feel his presence like a dark cloud hovering over the city, an oppressive weight in the air. He landed near the facility, crouching low to remain hidden in the shadows. The doors were heavily guarded, too heavily. The shard wasn't taking any chances. But Evan didn't need to break in through conventional means. His suit allowed him to phase through walls, to slip through the cracks of the world, unseen and unnoticed. He pressed his hand to the concrete wall of the facility, focusing on the energy patterns within. The suit hummed to life, a faint vibration running through him as the internal systems locked onto the nearest weak point. With a smooth motion, the wall rippled like liquid, and Evan passed through it, into the heart of the power station. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with electricity. The air crackled with an almost tangible force, as if the building itself were alive. At the center of the room stood the shard, his form a blur of shadow and light, his hands outstretched, feeding off the energy from the power grid. Evan, the shard's voice echoed in the chamber, cold and calculating. You've been trying to stop me all this time, but you don't understand. This power, it's what you've always wanted. It's yours for the taking. Just embrace it. Let go. Evan clenched his fists, his jaw set. The shard was right in one sense. The power in front of him, the raw, untamed antimatter energy, was the very thing Evan had been working toward. But he could see it now, in the shard's twisted expression, what that kind of power could do to a person. The shard had already lost himself to it. He had been consumed by his own ambition. I won't be like you, Evan replied, his voice firm. This city needs a protector, not a destroyer. The shard laughed, a hollow sound. You're already becoming one of us. You just don't realize it. Without warning, the shard thrust his hands forward, and a wave of energy shot toward Evan, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. The blast sent Evan sprawling to the ground, the suit's internal systems struggling to absorb the shock. Pain radiated through his body, his muscles screaming in protest, but Evan gritted his teeth, pushing through the pain. He couldn't let the shard win. He couldn't let his own creation be used for destruction. Drawing on every last ounce of strength, Evan stood, his hands trembling as he reached out to the generator that powered the suit. The antimatter surged through him, more intense than ever before, but this time, he used it to fuel his will, not his desire for power. The raw energy coursed through his veins, and with a cry of effort, he pushed it outward, forming a shield of energy around himself. The shard's eyes narrowed, realizing what Evan was doing. "You fool," he spat. "You can't control it. You'll burn yourself out." Evan smiled grimly. "Maybe. But I'm willing to try." With a forceful push, Evan released the energy, not as an attack, but as a wave of stabilization. The energy crackled, surging through the room, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The power grid, the antimatter, the city itself, all of it teetered on the brink of annihilation, and then, with a deafening roar, everything collapsed. Evan gasped, his body shaking with exhaustion as the surge of energy dissipated. He had done it. The shard had been defeated. The city's power grid was stabilizing, the lights slowly flickering back to life as the energy levels evened out, but Evan's victory came at a price. His body was drained, the cost of using so much energy taking its toll. His suit systems flickered, struggling to keep him alive. He staggered back, barely able to stand, but he was alive. The city was safe. For now, the shard, lying unconscious on the ground, was just another casualty of the city's struggle. But Evan knew the fight wasn't over. He had won this battle, but the war, against the corrupting influence of power itself, was far from finished. With the city slowly coming back to life around him, Evan knew one thing for sure: he would continue to protect it. No matter the cost, the city needed its guardian, and Evan White would be there. Evan staggered through the shadows of the power station, his head spinning, heart pounding. The battle with the shard had drained him. His body was barely holding on as the antimatter energy he'd unleashed continued to course through his veins. His hands were slick with sweat, and his suit systems were on the brink of failure, flickering in and out of functionality. The world around him was a blur, the air thick with the aftershocks of the chaotic energy that had just been unleashed. His vision was clouded, but he could still hear the hum of the city's power grid, now beginning to hum back to life, like the slow, tentative breath of something awakening from a deep slumber. But even as the city regained its pulse, Evan knew this wasn't over. The shard might have been defeated for now, but the damage he had caused was far from fixed. The power grid was still unstable. The ripple effects of the burst of energy would take hours, if not days, to stabilize. Worse, the cost of using that much antimatter energy had nearly incapacitated him. His entire body felt like it was on fire, each muscle screaming in protest as though they were being torn apart by the very force he had harnessed. He turned to check on the shard, his dark figure lying motionless in the center of the room, and for a moment, Evan's heart clenched. Was it really over? Did he truly defeat him? The shard had been right about one thing: Evan had pushed the boundaries of his own abilities, and for a brief moment, the power had nearly consumed him. What would happen next? How long before the city would need him again? Could he keep doing this? The questions swirled in his mind, an endless stream of doubt. With a weak groan, Evan forced himself to move toward the shard, every step a battle, his body rebelling against the strain. The villain lay motionless, his dark clothing and shadowed form now just another casualty of the power play between them. Evan bent down to check on him, his mind hazy from exhaustion, but his instincts still sharp enough to recognize the danger. The shard's pulse was slow, his breathing faint, but still present. "You're not dead," Evan muttered, almost to himself, as he reached out to adjust the shard's position. The villain's eyes flickered briefly, the pupils dilating in recognition as he struggled to focus. "I won't stay down for long," the shard rasped, his voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Evan shook his head, pushing himself up from the villain's side, his limbs trembling with the effort. "I'll stop you. No matter what it takes." He didn't know if the shard could hear him, but his words were more for himself than anyone else. They were a reminder of why he did what he did, why he'd sacrificed so much to protect this city. The weight of his own body began to take a toll. The sheer amount of energy he'd used had left him in a state of half-consciousness. His suit was barely functional, and he could feel the antimatter within him slowly draining. There was no time to waste. He needed to get out of the station, back to the safety of his lab. But every instinct told him that if he stayed here any longer, the next wave of energy could consume everything in its path. Evan turned and staggered out of the power station, using the last reserves of his strength to push through the wreckage, the darkened streets stretching before him like a labyrinth of uncertainty. The buildings, still without power, loomed over him, silent and unyielding, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, the sharp tang of destruction lingering in the atmosphere. The ground beneath him seemed to tremble with each step, the aftershocks of the battle rattling the very foundation of the city. He didn't know how long he walked, or where his feet were taking him, but eventually, he found himself back at his apartment. The world outside still felt unreal, like he was walking in a dream, the edges of his vision blurry, the weight of exhaustion threatening to pull him under. But he made it inside, and the moment the door shut behind him, he collapsed to the floor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His apartment was dark. Empty. Silent. It had been a long time since Evan had truly felt at peace here. His life, his work, had consumed him for so long that he'd almost forgotten what it meant to be still. To not be a protector, a hero, a soldier in an invisible war. Just Evan. Just the man behind the mask. But tonight, that man felt closer to a ghost than anything real. The antimatter power he had wielded had taken a toll on him that he couldn't ignore. His muscles ached, and his head spun with dizziness as he dragged himself to his feet. He stumbled toward his bedroom, but when he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the mirror, he stopped dead in his tracks. The man staring back at him was a stranger. The once clean lines of his face were now drawn and hollow, his eyes sunken from the strain of using the antimatter. His skin was pale, and the exhaustion was written in every part of his body. Even his lab coat, once pristine, was now torn and scorched, the seams undone from the battle. "I'm still here," Evan whispered to himself. But for how long? He didn't know the answer. And it was that uncertainty, that brutal realization, that made his stomach twist. He closed his eyes, sinking onto the bed. His fingers brushed against the fabric of the sheets, but all he could feel was the heavy weight of his own decisions. The shard had been stopped, for now, but the truth was, he was only delaying the inevitable. Power like this wasn't meant to be controlled. He knew that. And yet, there was no turning back. His life, his identity, had become intertwined with this force. As he lay there, trying to slow his breathing, trying to ignore the sharp throb of pain in his chest, he heard the faintest sound. A chime from his phone. With a groan, he reached over and picked it up, squinting as he checked the screen. It was a message from Claire. It read simply, "Everything all right? We lost power at the lab. What happened out there?" Evan stared at the message for a long moment. Claire was one of the few people who didn't just see him as a machine, a workhorse, or a superhero. She saw the man beneath it all, the one who longed for something more than just a life of experiments and equations. He typed out a quick reply, "I'll explain later. Just need some rest. I'll be back tomorrow." He hit send, then dropped the phone back on the bed beside him. There was no way he could explain what had happened tonight. How could he? The truth was far too dangerous to share, even with someone like Claire. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was something else, something that even he didn't fully understand. But the city needed him. And until that need faded, Evan White would continue to wear the mask, even if it cost him everything. For a moment, there was silence. The world outside still dark, the city beginning to heal, as the first flickers of light began to spread through the skyline. The battle was over for now. But Evan knew better than to think it was truly won. Some wars didn't end, and for the first time, Evan realized that perhaps the battle he'd been fighting wasn't just for the city. It was for himself. The antimatter guardian wasn't just a protector. He was the embodiment of the city's struggle, a constant battle between hope and destruction. And as long as there was a city to protect, Evan would fight, even if it meant losing everything he had left.